Thank you very much for attending this session. Just looking around, I don't need to introduce myself, I think. And so, again, this was supposed to be a double act with Francesco Montoni, who isn't here, as I mentioned before, but I'm really grateful to my colleague Michela Guglieri to do the double act with me. Michela is actually the clinical research lead at the John Ward Muscular Dystrophy Research Center in Newcastle, and also chief investigator for one of the gene therapy trials. So she's a great replacement for Francesco, and we'll talk about some of the trials that are currently ongoing in the UK. So I thought the previous session was more about, what's coming up, and this session is about latest clinical trial updates. And it will also be actually followed by a presentation from Emma Heslop about the central recruitment database that has recently been established in the UK for recruiting patients into clinical trials. So in terms of current gene therapy trials in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, there are 2 active studies where patients have already been dosed in the UK, and we have now introduced the concept that the companies that are sponsoring these trials use similar approaches, but the difference is within the construct, your healthy modified dystrophin gene, the vector, and also the promoter, basically the engine that is driving the expression of the transgene. Now, I've mentioned that the SOLID and the Genethon trial are trials that are not yet happening, but for Sarepta and for Pfizer, we have studies in the UK. And Michela will start to first talk a bit about the Pfizer study, where she is the chief investigator in the UK, and she'll kindly also cover the Sarepta gene therapy trial, where I'm the chief investigator in the UK. Over to you, Michela.
Thank you. So I just start actually presenting a little bit of which information do we have about this compound and what has been released so far. These are the information that we know about the compound that is used by Pfizer. Pfizer is currently running, as Volker mentioned, a placebo-controlled study. But in the meantime, in the US, they also run what we call a phase 1 clinical trial. The phase 1 is just the really early stages of the drug development, when there is an open label study, so all patients that have been recruited were treated with received gene therapy. But it's really to demonstrate primarily the safety of the compound, but in the meantime, is always the efficacy and the effect on functional outcome is always measured. So these are the results from a very small group of boys. It's the first data that have been released regarding the phase 1 study is 6 boys. The inclusion criteria of the phase 1 study was that boys need to be older than 4 at the time of recruitment, but it's included potentially both ambulatory and non-ambulatory patients, although these 6 are all ambulatory. And what they look at, as I mentioned, the study was mainly focused on safety, but they also looked at clinical outcome measure, and particularly they look into the changes in the North Star ambulatory outcome over the first year following gene therapy administration. So the study was an open label, so they do not have a control within the study, so they use an external control that in this case is in the first graph is the North Star ambulatory, is North Star network database. And this is, just to let you know, all the gray line are how boys, individual boys with Duchenne muscular dystrophy behave in terms of the performance on the North Stars over time. And the black line is just the mean, so what would we expect in that period of time. And they plot in a way the boys were treated, in blue is the boy that were treated with the low dose of gene therapy, and in red is the high dose of gene therapy. And obviously you can see that the boys seems to, with the exception of one on the low dose, they seems to either improve or maintain their North Star value over the 12 months period of time. They also compare the assessment on the North Star compared to some control group that come from other placebo-controlled studies still by Pfizer, recruiting a very similar population. And I think that is important to say that in both cases, what they try to match is boys that have a similar age and motor performance at the beginning. And what they notice is that while in the control group from other placebo-controlled study, we would expect a deterioration, so some lost of point on the North Star, the boys that receive either high doses or low doses of gene therapy seems to remain either stable or gain some point. And again, in blue here is the low dose, and the red is the high dose, and the circle with the cross in blue is the mean, so the average between the individual patient, and the cross in red is the average. But you can say that there is suggesting, therefore, that there is a positive impact of the gene therapy on motor function. But these are very limited number of patients and a 12 months follow-up. That is what we know about the Pfizer. As Volker mentioned, there is a phase 3 study with this compound currently open in the UK. The study enroll patients that are between the age of 4 and 7, and they need to be on stable. They need to be on corticosteroid for at least 6 months, and on stable regimen and dose for at least 3 months. And one characteristic is that they need to be on a specific, let's say, dose of corticosteroid. So that is listed here of 0.5 milligram, at least 0.5 milligram per kilo per day for prednisone, and 0.75 of the Flazacort, which is important. The study is currently running in London, in Liverpool, and in Newcastle. The current, at the moment, recruitment of a new patient is on hold, and as is following some safety event that Volker will present at the end of this presentation, a reason for which the protocol is currently under review by ethics in order to modify the protocol to reflect, in a way, the new safety information, and is excluding a group of patients with a certain type of mutation that are considered to be at higher risk. The patients that are already in the study can continue to be monitored, but in order to enroll, we need to wait for the amendment to be approved. And difficult to predict the timelines, but probably will be by the end of this year. The other company that is bringing gene therapy in the UK is Sarepta. Sarepta is actually, I think that is important this slide to highlight why that the development of gene therapy and the development in general drug development is a long process, and usually is never delivered by one study that gives us all the answer, but is a step-by-step process. So Sarepta has 4 active studies with a gene therapy compound for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Some of them have completed recruitment, and only the EMBARK study is currently they are all completed recruitment, but they are still open as a study, means that we are still collecting safety and efficacy data. So the 4 program is the study 101 was the first study that enrolled patients age 4 to 7, and enrolled only 4 patients. It's really a safety study. But I think that is important. I will present some data from this study, because this was the original study, and then we start to have data after up to 4 years of follow-up. The study 102 enrolled 41 patients, similar age, 4 to 7, and ambulatory patient. These 2 study in blue, the 102 is a similar age, but is a placebo-controlled study. The study 103 is an open-label study that has completed recruitment, enrolled patient age 3 and above, but both ambulant and non-ambulatory patient. And the study 301 is the one that is currently running in the UK. Enrollment has been completed in the involved sites, but we are continuing monitoring. And this is really the phase 3 study that is a placebo-controlled study that hopefully will really give us more information about the effect of the drug. But what do we know about the data so far? This is the 103 study, or Endeavour study. is a study that includes, as I mentioned, is a placebo control. Is an open label study that enroll about 40 patients in different cohorts. So involve patients that were both ambulant and non-ambulant, and different cohorts depend on the ambulatory status of the boy and on the age. We have some information in terms of data emerging on the the cohort number 1, that is the 4 to 7 year old, and are ambulatory and enroll 20 patients. And what we, the Straub release are the data, the functional data up to 1 year compared to an external control that was matched per age and for functional performance at baseline. And the data showed that the boys who had received the gene therapy, this again is an open label study, so we do not have a control within the study, but it's an external control, and that is highlighted in yellow. And the boys that were treated with gene therapy clearly in a way separate in terms of performance on the North Star compared to the matched control. And this is monitored up to 12 months, so week 52, with a difference of more than 3 points, almost 4 points on the North Star between the control group and the treated group. And the similar results were confirmed using other outcome measures. Here I presented the time to rise from the floor, but it was very consistent across the different outcome measures, including the time to walk or run 10 meters. And just to differentiate in a way the patient treated with gene therapy compared to the external control. And where the time to rise on the floor, you always need to think that so shorter is the time, so that is lower the line, better is the motor performance. So very encouraging results from this open label study of 20 patients. And that is what I've mentioned, that is the 10 meters, very similar results. So this is the result of the 101 study. As I mentioned, this is a very small study. It was the first study with the gene therapy Sarepta molecule, and only 4 boys were treated, so we need to take into consideration that any result from that study has the limitation in terms of number of patients that were involved, but have a very strong element that is the only one for which we have up to 4 years follow-up. So we start to collect some information on the long-term effect of the gene therapy. Data are encouraging. If we look at the population that were enrolled are children between the age of 4 and 6, what as I mentioned was a follow-up for 4 years. These are individual patients, and the last line is the mean. In terms of individual patient, you can see that they all improved on the North Star after 4 years, which I think that is, let's say, not expected for the natural history of the disease as much as we know, even though the younger boys, so the 4-year-old, we can expect for the natural history to improve just in response to corticosteroid and normal development, is probably not expected in a 6-year-old or in a 5 or above the age of 5. So very encouraging result, and the mean improvement on the North Star is up to 7 points. So looking also into the North Star, again, this is the 4 boys compared to an external control in yellow, and also when the data were compared with an external control, confirm that the boys that were treated seems to have an improvement on the North Star, when the boys who were not treated, so the control group, seems to have a decline over the 4-year period of time. Here I think that it's important also to see, if we look into the yellow line, so the external control, how when you took into external control, you see much more variability. And during the first year, they seems to deteriorate. During year 2, they seems to improve a lot, and then progressively deteriorate. And these really are some limitation in terms of using external control. And therefore, the importance of the data that will emerge from the placebo control study will be very, very relevant here. And that is exactly what is currently open in the UK. So the EMBARK study is a study that similar in a way in terms of the targeted population to boys age 4 to 7 that are ambulatory, is a phase 3 study that really want to investigate the long-term effect of the gene therapy on functional outcome, and the primary outcome is still the North Star. For the EMBARK, we have 3 sites in the UK, London, Newcastle, and Oxford. The recruitment is now closed, but the patients are continue to be monitored.
Thank you very much, Michela. And so recruitment is closed because recruitment for the entire trial is full. So we now have to wait again, as we explained, until the last patient that was recruited had the last visit, and then there will be a data log and the data will be looked at, and so only then we will hear about the outcome of the trial. Now, we had the question before about safety and what are adverse events. And so I just want to cover what the trials that have been conducted so far have taught us. And again, it's very important that the pharmaceutical companies will always adjust their protocols to meet the latest, safety requirements, make sure that these trials are as safe as possible. And so adjusting the protocols is really about just monitoring what we learn while we conduct the trial. And so this is a summary of the common effects in gene therapy, you could say. So 80% of patients experience some adverse events. Vomiting in the first week after gene therapy is something that is commonly seen, and boys recover. Again, you need to know about this because, hydration is important in this case. The families need to be informed about this, or, you just need to know. And you can also give drugs that actually suppress the feeling of feeling sick. And then we know that most of the virus goes into the liver, and that this can also damage the liver. And again, what we do is we monitor how the liver function looks. And there are good blood markers that allow us to do this. And so looking at this, we can then adjust also, because this is an immune response against the virus, how we treat the boys with immunosuppression. All of them are on steroid doses that suppress the immune system. Again, we can increase this or we can extend this. And so it's something, I think, where we feel now a bit more comfortable to also, respond to these immune responses. And then something we are very concerned about, of course, if the heart is going to show a response. Fortunately, again, we can monitor this. There are enzymes, troponin is one of them, but of course ECGs, echocardiograms. So all of this is now part of the monitoring of patients that receive gene therapy. In both the solid and the Pfizer trial, there were also cases of so-called atypical hemolytic uremic syndrome. This is basically a disease where small vessels in the kidney can clot. And of course, this could lead to kidney failure and would then require dialysis. So again, this is monitored very closely. Fortunately, there is actually a drug. This is mediated by the so-called complement system, which is an immune response. Eculizumab, that can be used to treat this side effect. Actually, at the time, that was the most expensive drug in the world when it was approved. So, it's a very expensive treatment of a side effect. It has been used also in at least one case in it's known to be affected when it comes to hemolytic uremic syndrome. So we monitor all of this, and we know that these are potential risk. Now, of course, you do hear about the worst case scenarios. There was a 16-year-old boy with Duchenne muscular dystrophy in the non-ambulant Pfizer trial who died 6 days after receiving the gene therapy. Most likely this was due to the involvement of the heart. Now, in this case, there was no autopsy done after the patient died, so there's limited information. But again, I mean, this means that, or meant in this case, that the protocol will be adjusted, that we need to look maybe more carefully than we did at the heart as well. And it's something I think really important where companies also start to then adjust protocols across different trials, learning about these events. And some of you may have heard that only very recently, and I think it was actually only publicly announced more widely at the beginning of this week, a 27-year-old Duchenne patient died in the States after receiving CRISPR-Cas, so gene editing, gene therapy. I said it's a combination of gene therapy and exon skipping. And you may wonder, well, how is it possible? This wasn't as part of one of the trials we have mentioned so far. So there is a non-profit organization called Cure Rare Disease, and it was actually the founder of that organization whose brother was affected, and they did get FDA permission to treat a single patient with CRISPR-Cas. Again, not much details have been revealed so far what the causality is, even whether this is due to the treatment or not. Nevertheless, it just also shows that we do have to be careful, and I mentioned before that there are ethical discussions that are important, and testing new drugs for the first time in humans comes with a risk. I think something that is very interesting as well, and Annemieke Aartsman-Roos mentioned this briefly this morning as well, that there were other side effects that were seen across multiple trials, and we have mentioned several times now that the companies use different viruses and different constructs, or transgenes, or healthy genes. But these adverse events or side effects were seen across the trial, so it was felt, well, it's unlikely that this is the virus, or that this is, because they're different viruses, that is causing these symptoms. And so what was observed was that 5 Duchenne patients aged 7 to 9 were dosed with a mini-dystrophin construct across 3 clinical trials, and this is the dose as well. And they had, similar events, symptoms that started about, 3 to 4 weeks up to 8 weeks after dosing, and it seems that this is exactly the time when the dystrophin is expressed, has become present in the muscle cells again. So the hypothesis was, well, based on the timing, it might well be related to dystrophin and not the virus. And these patients had central nervous system involvement and also distal muscle weakness. They had heart involvement, respiratory problems, but fortunately they improved, and patients were also treated with more immunosuppressants. And so it was felt that there's an immune response suggested to have a response not against the virus, but against the dystrophin protein. And this is a very complex but really helpful slide for everyone who's involved in these trials in developing the construct. I'll try to explain this. So what you see in the top box, and you might not be able to read this, but these are the 3 transgenes or constructs that the companies used for Pfizer, Sarepta, Genethon, and Solid. And so the green boxes are basically the portions of the dystrophin protein present in the gene therapy. And then in the next box with the red alert, these are the mutations within the gene. So in the uppermost row, the exons list the different exons within the gene. These are the mutations that these patients had. And what was quite interesting is that many of them had mutations that included the first exons. So as you know, the pointer doesn't really work well. So in this area here. And so in the next box, you see mutations from other patients that didn't really show any of these symptoms. And you can see that many of them had also duplications in this region or deletions further out. And then patients in the middle part really didn't show any problems. So based on this analysis, if you really start to do this across trials, and what's extremely helpful, and Francesco isn't here because he was rightfully so awarded by the World Duchenne Organization with a prize for bringing companies also together to say, well, we have to look at our data across trials to increase safety for patients. So based on this now, it is assumed that the observed clinical events, which we know are mediated through a specific immune response, are because of patients that have certain genetic changes. And now some of this is very much medical jargon now, but I think what the conclusion, what is important is that based on this thorough analysis, we now feel that it might be safer to exclude certain patients with certain mutations from these trials. And so, this means that the inclusion and exclusion criteria are changing in some of these protocols. It also, of course, tells us that, gene therapy isn't the cure and might not be applicable to all patients. We already mentioned antibodies against the virus can be a problem, but an immune response against the dystrophin molecule might also be a challenge. So it's something that we learn while we go along with these studies. And it's something that, again, no one was really able to predict, similar to what I mentioned earlier today about the myotubular myopathy trial, where it was a trial that informed you about the risk. In that case, it was more liver involvement. So I think what's an important message for families and patients is this is research done in humans. Clinical trials aren't treatments yet, but they will, of course, provide us with important information how to make treatments in the future safer and hopefully more effective. So this was basically a summary of what's currently happening, what have we learned. As I said, we still need to wait to see now what the phase 3 trials that are ongoing will show us. And then there were a few questions about what is about the long-term effect. Well, that's exactly what we need to wait and see. Something else that is important, and I want to thank you on behalf of Michela and myself so far, because I will hand over to Emma Heslop, who's a coordinator for the Duchenne Hub in the UK. And she's also the lead for networking in the John Walton Center in Newcastle. But throughout the Duchenne Hub, we have also developed a new recruitment system for clinical trials that Emma will report about. Thank you.
Great. Hi, thanks. As Volker said, my name's Emma Heslop. I work as part of the team in the John Walton Muscular Dystrophy Research Centre at Newcastle University. Thank you very much to Action Duchenne for inviting us to speak and for the opportunity to really present to you about the work that we're doing in the DMD Hub, specifically thinking about what we can do in terms of ensuring that patients get fair and equitable access to clinical trials. So hopefully this presentation will follow on quite nicely from everything that you've heard today, but also from what Volker and Marie Christina presented yesterday. So it's not specific to gene therapy, but it is related to gene therapy as well. So I wanted to kind of start off by just emphasizing for people who haven't heard about the DMD Hub before is that it's a collaboration, and it's a collaboration between the patient organisation Duchenne UK and the leading centres of excellence for neuromuscular diseases in the UK, the John Walton Centre and Great Ormond Street in a hospital in London. Importantly to mention as well is that it's patient-centred. It's patient-centred because we have, we work with Duchenne UK, but specifically we work with Emily and Alex, who are the co-founders of Duchenne UK, but are mums to Jack and to Eli. So everything that we do, we think about, what is coming from the patient community. And back in 2016, 2015, 2016, when we actually established the DMD Hub, it was Emily and Alex who thought, or they were hearing from the community that parents were trying to get their children onto clinical trials for Duchenne, but they were unable to. So the problem that we worked out as to why was this happening is because at that point there was a pipeline of trials coming through, and there weren't enough clinical trial centres to be able to run these trials. So actually, at that point, trials were being turned away from the UK, which of course nobody wants, because we've worked so hard to make sure that these trials come and the trials translate into opportunities for boys to take part in them. The specific issue was that the experienced centres didn't have capacity to take on any of the other trials, and other centres that were interested and they saw patients with neuromuscular disease just didn't have the expertise to be able to do the clinical trials. So we wanted to relieve that initial capacity issue at the experienced sites while providing training and education for the less experienced sites. And the solution is the DMD Hub. And the DMD Hub essentially is now, 6 years later, an established network of what we can call ready-made sites that are able to deliver clinical trials across the UK in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. As I mentioned earlier, it was Newcastle and Great Ormond Street in London, but now we have a total of 11, so 9 additional hub sites have been brought on board. The idea is that this network is now a one-stop shop for industry to come to. It's a coordination activity. We provide resources for parents and patients as well as for sites, and we share knowledge and expertise throughout this network in various different mechanisms. So we have networks where PIs can participate in and discussion forums, but we also have thought about other healthcare professionals that are involved in delivering trials, including nurses and clinical trial coordinators. This little map we're in the process of updating, but it basically just emphasizes the fact that all of the sites that are involved in the DMD Hub have now run trials in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and they are building all of the time on their experience. What we've specifically achieved since 2016 to help transform the UK DMD clinical trial landscape is that through £3.2 million invested by Duchenne UK to date, and more promised in the future, we funded 34 posts, and those 34 posts have been split between the 11 different hub sites. And how we decided which posts to fund at which sites is that we kind of went around and we spoke to each of the clinical teams to try and understand their specific needs of, if you were to take, for you to take on a clinical trial, what do you need to deliver that? And in some cases, it was that they needed nurses, others physios, clinical trial coordinators, doctor time. So it really was kind of bespoke depending on the needs of the individual site. But what that's translated into is the ability for 40 clinical trials to come to the UK since 2016, and of course I'm not suggesting that that's solely to do with the DMD Hub, but hopefully what we've provided and the infrastructure that we've put in place has undoubtedly facilitated that. And the 40 clinical trials translates into 437 boys being enrolled onto those trials. That includes all the trials that we've talked about, over the course of the 2 days, so some interventional, some non-interventional. But when we looked at the data, 72 of those boys were enrolled into interventional trials. And then just thinking specifically about 2022, so far we've engaged with 13 companies, many of whom are in this room today. And, again, that engagement is based on what they need at that particular time. So we can help with the identification of sites or recruitment for patients for sites. And so far this year, 8 trials have opened, and there is another 11 at a feasibility stage. One of the main ways that we've been able to achieve this is through collaboration. Right from the start, we wanted to ensure that we weren't duplicating effort and we weren't wasting resources. And, when I'm talking about resources, I'm not just talking about money. I'm talking about patients and patients' time and patients' energy and effort. So we work, as I mentioned right at the start, with Duchenne UK and the John Walton Centre. But we work with other patient organisations and, importantly, obviously, with sites. And we work with industry and, more recently, contract research organisations, but other organisations that are involved in delivering the same aims and objectives as we are. So National Institute of Health Research is one, for example, and more recently we've been working with Catapult, which is a Catapult Cell and Gene Therapies, which is a UK-funded, government-funded initiative that's thinking about how to ensure that gene therapy trials come to the UK. Recently, there was a press release, I think it was, by the Association of British Pharmaceutical Industry, which said that since 2017, the number of clinical trials initiated in the UK has dropped by 41%. Obviously, that's a very shocking statistic. So it made us go back and look at the data that we had for Duchenne trials. And we were reassured somewhat. It's a little bit of so the number of trials that we had in 2017, I think, was significantly increased to what we had the previous few years. And that, in part, was because the posts that we'd funded as part of the DMD hub were then, being put into post, and were starting to have an effect on the site. The sites were starting to have an effect on the number of trials that they were running. Then obviously during COVID of 2020 and 2021, we expected that there weren't going to be enough, many trials opening up. The good thing was that the trials that were open were still able to run, but there weren't many new trials opened up because of the restrictions placed on some of the sites due to COVID and the travel and everything like that. But the positive news also is that in 2022, the number of trials have gone back up. It's almost like they were kind of waiting during 2020 and 2021 to open. And the even more positive news is that there's even more trials that are predicted to be opening up or planned in the pipeline for 2023. So I think that we feel quite reassured that the work that we've done in the Duchenne community helps kind of protect from that overall statistic of what the ABPI presented. So the way that we've been able to develop this network and some of the initiatives that we've developed, we try and put on the DMD Hub website as a way for people to be able to access and a way of facilitating this working together. For patients specifically, if you wanted to be kept up to date with the work that we're doing in the DMD Hub, I would encourage you to sign up to the news item, where we don't overload, hopefully, everybody with information, but we do put information on there. But also the website hosts what we call the Interactive Clinical Trial Finder, which Volker introduced briefly yesterday, but I can provide a little bit more information about. Again, that's the link to the Clinical Trial Finder. And this is something that we initiated quite early on in the DMD Hub, so I think probably 2017, 2018 it was active. Again, from something that, what we were hearing from the patient community in terms of frustrations around, by the time we hear about clinical trials, they're already set up and they're already being run at trial sites, and there's no opportunity for us to then get enrolled onto these trials. So the Clinical Trial Finder, we work very closely with the sites and we work very closely with industry to ensure that every trial that is opening in the UK is on the Clinical Trial Finder and is put onto the Clinical Trial Finder at an appropriate time. So not too early when we're not sure 100% that it's going to come to the UK, and not too late in terms of that it's already fully recruited at those particular sites. And one important element to the Clinical Trial Finder is it lists which sites the trial has been run at and the recruitment status at that particular site. And the reason that's important is because not all sites open all at the same time in the UK. So it might be that one site's fully recruited, but another one is still looking for patients. And you can go onto this Clinical Trial Finder at any time, and you can search. There's different criteria. You can search by either by location, the type of trial that you're interested in, whether you would need to have a muscle biopsy for that particular trial or not. So you can, really filter that to have a kind of bespoke list of trials that you might be potentially interested in. So we had that on the website for a number of years, but then we realized that actually it could be further improved, and we should improve it further, because at that point, it was then left to the patient to proactively contact the sites to express their interest in taking part in trials. So what we've developed now is the Central Recruitment Database. And this, the purpose of the Central Recruitment Database is to establish a centrally coordinated national recruitment database for people with Duchenne who are interested in participating in research studies. So this is going to be the resource in the UK that if you're interested in taking part in a clinical trial, if you're registered on that, you can be considered by each of the individual sites that are recruiting for clinical trials. So the overall aim is to provide fair and equitable access to clinical trials. And again, that was patient-driven, but one of the happy side effects of that is that it's also really supporting recruitment and supporting the sites that are delivering the research to identify patients so that they can recruit as quickly and as effectively as possible. So, I won't go into too much detail about this, but in terms of how the process works once patients have registered on the Central Recruitment Database, it's initiated by the trial site. So the trial site who is running a trial and they know how many patients they're looking to recruit from the Central Recruitment List would contact the DMD Hub team to let us know they would like us to identify maybe one, maybe two patients. Then we ask them to complete a recruitment request form, which is obviously based on the eligibility criteria for the clinical trial. And once we receive that, the project steering committee vote to say, yes, we think this is an appropriate study that we should engage with, and yes, please do look for eligible patients in the Central Recruitment Database. Once those patients have been identified, it might be that there's 10 patients that are identified that are potentially eligible. We would do a random selection of those 10 patients and send the number of patient details to the site that they asked for. So if they only asked for one patient, we would only send details of one patient, but that one patient is selected randomly. Phil would then send an electronic folder with all of the relevant information over to the hub site securely, and then it's up to the trial site to then take over the responsibility to contact the patient, but also they have the ability to contact the local clinician to ask for additional information about the patient, because obviously that's where they've been seen and they know them as well. The one thing that we do ask is that, after a couple of weeks, we follow up with the trial site to understand whether that patient was or wasn't screened, and if they were screened, were they recruited for that trial? And if they were recruited, fantastic, and if they weren't, that for whatever reason, then they would go back into the Central Recruitment Database and then would be considered potentially eligible for other clinical trials. The progress since the launch, which was just in April this year, is that we have 131 people registered on the Central Recruitment Database. And an important thing to say about that is that they are registered patients with Duchenne with a confirmed genetic diagnosis. The age range of patients who have registered are between 1 and 40, with the average age of being 9. and participants from 19 of the, I think, 23 North Star sites have registered in the database. So even in these first few months, we've had a very, very positive response to that. And one of the specific successes that we've had is that we have been able to recruit patients to a number of clinical trials successfully through the central recruitment database. And some people might be aware of this story that went out just a couple of weeks ago about Charlie, who was successfully recruited through the central recruitment database to the Sarepta EMBARK gene therapy trial. So Charlie's been absolutely amazing, and his family have been so generous in allowing us to use this as a specific example to illustrate how the process can work. And Jennifer, his mum, gave a lovely quote to say, that she genuinely feels like without being on the central recruitment database, Charlie wouldn't have had this opportunity to take part in gene therapy trials, because he lives in Aberdeen and his local care was in Aberdeen, and he was treated at Newcastle. So the other good thing to say is that sites are engaged and they are using the central recruitment database to recruit to trials, including gene therapy trials. To date, we've had 4 trial sites use the central recruitment database for 6 trials, which actually since April is all of the trials that have been recruited in the UK. So I don't think we could have done any better than that. For more information, about the central recruitment database, like I said, we've got the website. You can scan the QR code. There's leaflets at the back of the room if you want a little bit more information on that, or I'm here for the rest of the day. You can ask me anything that you want to know or follow up on. And my colleague Paul is here as well, who also works on the central recruitment database. So the specific website address for the central recruitment database is the dmdhubrecruits.org. And then my last slide, I wanted to take a very quick opportunity to highlight some other work that we're going to be doing, and unfortunately it's not ready to be launched today, but it should be ready in the next couple of weeks, is a patient preference survey, specifically around participation in gene therapy trials. So as I mentioned throughout the talk, the patient voice is at the center of everything that we do. And we want to be able to hear from patients directly their thoughts on gene therapy clinical trials, so that we can see how their knowledge and preferences have changed over the last 5 years, because it's based on a very similar study that was done by PPMD and RTI in 2017. And there's a number of publications that have resulted from that work. So the survey that we're using is comparable to that one, so we can see, the more that we know now, has it changed what people think about gene therapy trials? And obviously based on the information that you've heard throughout the presentations today, does that affect people's decision about, whether they want to have their children enrolled on clinical trials or not? And the idea is that the results from this patient preference survey will help inform discussions with regulators as well, but generally inform the community. So the survey will be sent out to patients across the UK via Duchenne UK. And like I said, it should be within the next couple of weeks. But if you're really keen or you want to help anymore, my colleague Megan at Newcastle would be the person to contact to follow up on that, or ask me after this presentation as well. And that is everything. So thank you very much. If anybody's got any questions, I'm more than happy to take them.